to whom I'd like to thank, as well as to the colleagues that put some effort to put together this event, all of them. Now I'll pass the floor to Andreas, and then we'll have the talks of our guests, and we'll have a time for discussion and reflections in terms of the perspectives of more effective policies for our cities. Thank you very much. Andreas, the floor is yours. Silvana, it's such a pleasure to be here at this house, in your house, where we can have this symposium at ABC University. I also would like to thank for the presence of those who are going to speak today, especially Leszek, that came from Europe, from very far away, to share his vision about fair free all over the world, and Lucio, who is so involved in fair free public transportation here in Brazil, and for insisting so much on this topic. So I have the pleasure of being here. I'd like to greet you all and all the audience that is here. And I'd like to say that this is an event that is a partnership between IDEC, Rosa Luxemburgo, Territorial Planning, and the Periferia Foundation. About Rosa Luxemburgo Foundation, this is a German foundation connected to a political party called the Linke, the left wing, and as all members of the parliament in Germany, they have a foundation called Rosa Luxemburg that operates in several parts of the world, always in partnership with movements and social organizations in many topics such as urban mobility, among others. All over the world, we have more than 20 offices scattered throughout the world doing this kind of work, and we've been working in a network, and I'd like to mention the Brussels office in Belgium, where we have been having a great partnership on the topic of mobility, fare free. We have put together several events together, and the office back there in Brussels is also broadcasting this event that is being translated into English. Mexico and other parts of the world is also broadcasting this event so others can take part in those topics we're going to discuss. I don't want to speak too much because we will have very interesting talks, but we are located, I work in São Caetano, which is a fare-free city. Many of those who are here were there in São Caetano city, getting to know how this fare-free transportation system works there. And this is one of the biggest topics on how to implement, in addition to fight for that, on how to implement it. That is something that is very important on how to do that, because we have free fare in several cities in Brazil, but you cannot say that we always follow the same steps because there are many different interests behind it. I'd like to highlight that from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, we see that mobility in general is a human right, and based on that, we are proposing the way it should be implemented. how this tool should be implemented, which is a right and not a favor given from a company or from the government. So it's important to have this discussion about the implementation and what is behind it. In many places of the world, this discussion is taking place, such as in Germany. We had a debate on that during the pandemic when on a fare ticket was €9 for the whole month. That was a very interesting experience, but also very discussed because the price was too low, but many people left their cars at home or not. Well, not that much. So we have lots of things to discuss when it comes to fare free. And now I will pass the floor to Annie to do the facilitation of this roundtable.
Oi, gente. Boa tarde.
Hi, my name is Annie. I am a urban mobility analyst from ADEC, the Consumers Defense Agency, so I'm responsible for free fare, so it's an honor to be here. I will facilitate this roundtable, and I will maybe make it more difficult because I'll ask you a few questions. I'm a non-binary person, so you can call me he, she, or they. And what we're going to do today is to think about this. We are working on fare free on ABC, on the state of São Paulo, and then we're going to have a history overview in Brazil and on the world, and then we're going to see a very well consolidated example, that is the example of the city of Maricá. And we're going to have at the end a Q&A session. Those that are watching us online and need to get a certification, you will receive a certification, as well as those that are here in person. But before calling our guests, I will say, hail the national strike on this country. Hey, folks, yeah, react. Yeah, awesome. It's key to remember that university has to be an open space where people can come. And we consider the possibility of having this auditorium closed and have everybody out there, but being on a strike is crucial, and this activity is part of a program, as Professor Silvana has said, on this program for the strike, and about rights in Brazil, human rights in Brazil. And thus I'm going to call the first two guests that are the council representative of São Caetano do Sul, Bruna Biondi, and the representative Marici, elected by the PT party in São Paulo.
Tudo bem? Boa tarde, beleza? Bom, vocês...
Well, you have 10 minutes each, and you're going to talk about the fare free in São Caetano, and you know that there will be city elections ahead, so tell us how your political party is considering this topic, the contradiction and possibilities that you foresee. 10 minutes for each, please. Bruna, you first. Good afternoon to you all. My name is Bruna. I am a city councilor of PSOL. Can you hear me well? I think this microphone is not so good. I have been elected in 2020 as the third biggest, getting more votes in São Caetano, is the third person being voted in São Caetano. And I was graduated by the University of São Paulo, and so happy to have this invitation from Silvana and Ami, who called me and made this invitation on this topic that I like so much. And it's obvious that I cannot talk about Fair Free before highlighting the importance of the strike. When I think about Fair Free as a right for something that is public, which is the city, it's also important to think about the public universities and the cuts we're having in the budgets that we should have. So I'm happy to know that this is part of the strike activities. Well, I'd like to talk about the experience we had at São Caetano City, and we're going to have experts talking about this, so I will share the experience we had in our city that in last November have implemented Fair Free. But São Caetano has some particularities. We have 15.3 square kilometers. It's like a neighborhood in São Paulo. We have around 66,000 inhabitants. It's a dense, vertical city, and this city has grown 162,000 inhabitants. I'm sorry. So we have grown around GM. So there is an encouragement for people to own their cars. So when São Paulo was growing, they really focus on the expansion of roads. It's a city that is close to São Paulo, Santo André, and São Bernardo, but they were also encouraging private cars. Why is it important to mention the specific features of São Caetano before the 90s? We left from a city that was part of ABC with the highest bus fare in the region, costing 5 reals, and when we compare this with São Paulo fare, where we have which was a way bigger city that is 440, and we compare it with São Bernardo or Santo André, we are proportionally speaking the most expensive. We have the most expensive bus fare in this area with very low encouragement of the use of public transportation. So the company that is operating on Fair Free up to 2027, because this contract will finish in 2027, is the same company that is there at the city since 2007. Only in 2015, we had students' special fare that was restricted to one specific bus route in a specific time. So that was focused on leaving home, going to school, and going back from school to get back home. So restricted to going or coming back from school, which didn't consider going to libraries or parks or whatever. And São Caetano didn't pay any subsidy for the bus companies at all. So in 2023, last time I got together with the owner of the bus company, he said that we were living in a scenario where out of every 6 passengers, 4 didn't pay. They were either students or senior citizens. So only 2 would pay. And that was a justification for the company to increase the fare all the time as much as they wanted, because that was a way to bargain with the city administration. So if the city administration would not subsidize it, I can increase the bus fare. And the city council is never interested in thinking about public transportation as a public road. So it was very common that people would walk around the city, because the city is quite tiny, so it would be much better to walk and way cheaper to grab a Uber rather than grab a bus. So at a fare at 5 reals, and the Uber would cost 8 reals. So it would be way better. So you didn't need to wait for the bus and get a crowded bus, and people used to walk a lot. So the discussion of free fare, fare free, came in December to be discussed. Without much discussion, there was no debates with the activists of urban mobility about it. And the project came in October to the City Hall, and in 2 days it was being voted. And the project was talking about the principles of free or fare free and how the city would organize their budget in a way to pay for the fare free. And there are some points that we have to pay attention to, such as fines, carbon credits, contradictory topic. So there was no proper study on the implementation of fare free. And we were voting fare free without even knowing whether the city administration would pay it back to the company by passenger or by mileage. So what kind of fare free would we get in São Caetano? But at the same time, we had a unique opportunity to approve something very progressive in terms of public transportation in the city, and we could not lose that opportunity. At that time, our term have put together some amendments to try to improve this project, including the participation, the political participation. One of them would be to have a participatory council that would put together the city administration, civil society, and the company to discuss about the implementation of this policy.
The obligation of public hearings that would present the spreadsheets, because today the city has a contract where they set up a cap amount that they can pass on to the bus company. So they say the bus company, I can spend X money with you, and that money is calculated based on different indicators that the company has to follow. So if they took a certain number of trips, if they needed to buy an extra bus or hire more staff, that all gets into the calculation, and there's a cap on the money that the city can pass on to the company. And none of that came together with the Bill of Law for us to approve. None of this information was there. And actually, when it was approved, it wasn't on the transparency portal, which is a portal where all this information is supposed to be made public. So it was very difficult to have access to all this information. But of course, approving the fare-free public transport in the city was needed, even though we fought for improvements, even though we fought for its permanence, because we're debating on that today. This year is an electoral year, and approving the fare-free public transport late last year is also related to an electoral move. So that's why you try to analyze all the amendments to make sure it wasn't an electoral measure. And the money that is gotten from parking, street parking, that money should be transferred to the fare-free public transport. There's a privating logic that in many cities here in the area of ABC, the same for the São Paulo city, but the company that operates in São Caetano, for instance, 20% of the money they make goes to the city, and all the rest is profit for the company. And one last amendment to the Bill of Law was that the service was offered by the company that currently works in the city, called VP, until the end of their contract. But after that, the city of São Caetano would create a public transport company to follow with the fare-free public transportation. So after that, of course, the amendments were not approved, but it was an attempt that we did. So after designing this policy, we started following up the implementation per se. We more than doubled the number of passengers in the city. We went from 22,000 passenger. Now I don't know what's like today, but the last public data we had, we were at about 60,000 passengers a day, and that definitely has a motivation of universalizing transport per se, because when you have transport available, you're going to use it, you're going to start taking public transport, and you are going to acquire your right to the city, and also because you break the logic of the need to walk or get an Uber. And of course I'm saying that with no data or science backing me up, but I dare to say that the number of people who drive is reduced, but mostly those people who use the fare-free public transport today are those people who used Uber, for instance, like the app drivers, and or they would walk. And what about the implementation? As we implemented the policy, that was and is being sort of confusing. We saw an exponential increase of lines to get the bus. The bus are pretty crowded, and there was no actual increase in the number of buses available in the city. So we did make a questionnaire to see people's satisfaction regarding the fare-free transport. I'm not talking about a scientific result or scientific research, but just as a way to measure people's opinion and how they thought about implementing the policy. So this was answered by over 100 people, and they all made negative comments. Of course, that what mobilizes people to answer that is actually because they're not satisfied. But this dissatisfaction in general is around long lines, crowded buses. But one key element is that the drivers. They say a lot about the drivers driving too fast. Actually, new drivers that were not traditional drivers for the company, and buses that are no longer stopping at the bus stop to pick up new passengers. And to wrap up, I like to talk a little bit about our concerns implementing that. One thing I have said is that our city does not have a tradition to debate urban mobility in a collective way, and it's sort of in a hurry implemented and kind of turned around their scenario. That is somehow a concern because it is an electoral process and we don't even know what is going to happen to it. Another concern is that the study to implement the fare-free public transport is a 3-year study. The city did it for 3 years because the contract with the company ends in 3 years. So we're really worried in 3 years' time if the fare-free public transport will continue or not. But more than that, after the election, if the next mayor elected will keep this policy. And there's also been an increase of a speech of limiting the fare-free public transport to the citizen of the city only. We have a policy in the city that it's a citizen card, the São Caetano card, that all the residents of the city use it, and they are used for universal policies such as the universal healthcare system. That is our most universal policy. Everybody knows that a foreign person in Brazil can go to a free clinic here in Brazil, but in the city of São Caetano, if you don't have that card, you cannot follow the natural flow of things. So the politicians in the city are already talking about it, saying that the fare-free public transport will only be working if it's limited to the citizen of the city, which is outrageous. And also another alternatives, and now I'm going to really wrap it up, because I think we need to think about the São Caetano experiences, the things that went right, the things that went wrong, and the whole engagement that is not technical, but also all the political traits involving this topic, thinking about the possible alternatives. It doesn't make sense that a city with such budget, such high budget, give another company to do that service, where the city itself can create cooperatives or have its own company to generate public jobs by hiring people. It's possible to have a municipal transport company, but we saw that in the post-pandemic period, transport companies are somehow trying to be saved, and this company was really not doing so well. So those are all the challenges on how we have more transparent expenses, how to show indicators that are not presented to the population, how to make sure we have a fair, free public transport that works well, that is real, that allows people to move around the city, and that we also move forward to a less private logic of putting money in the pockets of a company where we don't know exactly how they spend their money and how this is going to go forward. So that's what our term has been, that's our administration has been defending for having a public transport company. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone here. Again, good afternoon, everyone. So this is the better mic. So once again, I'd like to greet the initiative of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Federal University of ABC, Professor Silvana, Danielle. I'd like to greet Rafael, Professor Lucio, who, together with Professor Silvana, took part of an activity that our administration has promoted at the State Assembly about a topic that we're discussing here today. I'm like the city councilor, I'm not an expert on the topic. I'm, as you remember, I get into this debate because one of my concerns as a state representative is the metropolitan area concern. That means it's a relatively new phenomenon in history of mankind, and in the way we face urban matters in the country, we do not have public policies of a metropolitan character to face a serious problem. So most of the public functions dealing with the city, and urban mobility is one of them. It's something that the city can no longer take care of in such a metropolitan area like São Paulo. So the mobility and the free fare public transportation gets into my administration with that bias. If we see, we have 39 different municipalities making up the metropolitan area of São Paulo. So we have 40 different transport system, bus transport system. Each municipality has its own system, plus the EMTU, which is the metropolitan area. I am from the city of Franco da Rocha, which is in the metropolitan area. Nobody leaves any of those cities in the outskirts to go downtown to that same city. They leave the outskirts of the city to go wherever they're going to work, whatever the job is available, or whatever they can go to a store, for instance. However, those systems are not integrated, and that no longer makes any sense. The systems are not integrated, and the modals are not integrated. So there's a complete irrationality in the urban mobility systems in the São Paulo metropolitan area. So we start this debate by proposing the need for a metropolitan authority to deal with many issues. The environmental issue, for instance, health, not so much because we do have the universal healthcare system, but the urban mobility issue is one of those things that, in our point of view, needs to be dealt with in a more metropolitan way. One clear example of that, and a recent one, is the city of São Paulo proposing the fare-free public transport, and the government of the state was raising the prices of the fare on the railway transport. So what's going to happen? People are going to migrate from trains and subway to buses. What effect is that going to have on buses if we do have fare-free public transport on buses? So that's one of the aspects. Another one that is important to say is, why am I aware of this matters? Not only because of that, I must say that I was city councilor and mayor in the city of Franco da Rocha. I was the secretary of government and communication in the city of Santo André, and I was responsible for a supply company that was really focused on the metropolitan area of São Paulo. That's why I'm so interested in this matter. It is true, and the city councilor has already said that the cities in Brazil and the world, but Brazil specifically, they were designed for individual transport. The whole policy for the car to run well, from the way we concept cities to technologies. For example, the smart traffic lights that do privilege car flow. and not, transit flow. And that was all made for private transport to work, and that's all paid with public money, right? So the poor population, which is mostly the people who actually take buses and public transport, they pay their taxes twice. First of all, they pay their taxes to keep the roads with no potholes, every 2 or 3 lanes for cars to drive. Everybody pays for that through their taxes, and then they also pay to use the bus. So that's paid twice. So that doesn't only show how what our society is, that is misogynist, racist, and elitist, which penalizes the most vulnerable sectors of society, including the mobility system, but that only receives more attention from authorities and the public opinion when you think of costing, when the public transport system fails, when the bus companies no longer fund electoral campaigns, or when they systematically lose system users to the system as fares go up. So a lot of people start being aware of mobility and fare-free public transport. So I am widely concerned that this topic doesn't go into a support for the bus company owners. They can no longer support their business with the fare, and they're going to go to the public power asking for them to fund their activity. And that's a question that I have to myself on the initiatives of local powers to do with that, because it's undeniable that if you do not create other sources for funding, you are supposed to use the public budget of the city. So that's money that could be in healthcare, education, environment, and that it's going to be funded by businessmen, not necessarily meaning more quality in public transport. So how can we deny that once you implement a fare-free public transport, it means more appropriations of the city by the people? It's impossible to deny that. So we have to find a middle ground between these two things, in my opinion. And finding those middle grounds, in my opinion, come with the proposal of the constitutional amendment presented in National Congress by Representative Luiz Erundina, which creates a single public mobility system, which offers cities and states the possibility to create new sources of revenue, of income, so that individual transport funds public transport. So going beyond integration, we have other things that need to be analyzed. There are some interesting experiences in the country. Some of them did go forward, others did not move forward. I'm not making a pun on words here. But for example, the experience in Rio de Janeiro, in São José dos Campos, to change the system that we hire the company that provides the service. That's very interesting because they kind of break up with the logic of low mileage, higher fare, and higher subsidy. So instead of having one RFP for the company to operate public transport, you have one RFP to hire a one lot, and many different companies can participate on that lot. And then we also can hire the renting of the buses. And finally, you hire someone who actually operates the system. So it's innovative, it's very important, and I believe we need to be aware of what's going on. So I still have 3 minutes. Good for me. So that's one of my fears. I know that the city of São Caetano, from what I saw, I'm sorry I couldn't see that in person, but it seems to be very successful. However, showing their problems, which is the reaction of those who feel penalized. Apparently, from what I heard from the city councilor, is the middle class population saying, hey, free transfer for the poor people, what's that? Why do I have to pay for them, right? That's a typical reaction from Brazilian patrimonialism, but there's also that reaction of saying, hey, but that's São Caetano money that is making it easier for people who live in other cities to move here in our city. So how do we face that contradiction? By trying to build a universal policy. I recently went to Lisbon to celebrate the 25th of April, and when I got into the hotel, they gave me a card that allowed me to take any public transportation, trams, buses, subway, and I didn't really have time to understand how it works. Is it only for us tourists, or is it for the whole population, and how do they fund that? However, it's something that I'm thinking about. So back to the city of São Caetano. It's a small city in terms of territory. It is served by intermunicipal bus lines as well as train lines. The secretary was telling me that the experience has been better than we could imagine. But when you go to the city of Maricá, they have oil money to fund that policy. I don't know what it's like in Caucaia, in the state of Ceará, which seems the most interesting experience. It's a large city in the metropolitan area of Fortaleza, the capital of the state, and certainly they have answers that we should hear. I am willing to know more and more those experiences, either in Brazil or the world, whenever I can. And more than that, I'm willing to contribute on the debate in all different cities. I believe that the electoral campaign is a good moment to bring on that debate, and also talk about the importance of pressing our congressmen to move on with this policy of a universal policy that ends to end by taxing from the workers who move around the city and allow the use of the urban space by everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Representative. I brought here a notebook, which is the system of that seminar we had at the assembly, the state assembly. That's also available electronically. If you're interested, please get in touch with the organizers of the event, Professor Silvana, and it will be a pleasure to give that to you. So it's all here. Well, everyone, after those talks discussing our regional situation of the greater São Paulo area, the ABC area in the state of São Paulo, I'm going to invite two people, and I'm very emotional. So, the first person I'm going to call up on stage is Wojciech. He's a doctor. He is a professor at the University of Brussels in the geography department. He came to Brazil and got in touch with our network, fostered by the work of Rosa Luxemburgo in 2019, when we had our first meeting for fare-free public transport as a right. He works in partnership with our research network that is being made here in Brazil. He's worked with research with fare-free in the United States, and it's a joy to have you here. So please come up on stage.
Wojciech is going to speak in English, but you have the simultaneous translation available. So if you don't have your headsets, you can get them there. Oh, please stay. Yeah, please stay with us. And the second person I'd like to call to the stage is Lúcio Gregório. He is an engineer. Secretariat of Urban Mobility during Luiz Erundina administration, which has proposed the implementation of fare free in the city of São Paulo in the 1990s, when I was a baby. And Lúcio has educated all of us as social movements to understand that fare free could be something as a universal right. At any point, he stopped talking about this. Lúcio, at the end of the day, teaches and makes us all be here. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today with us. You cannot speak for life. You only have They are excellent institutions. So people as well. 1961. People would say that drunk people would take the bus and all of people. No, that's not reality. So we have problems that have to be solved. We don't have so many drunk uh, and crazy people in the city. By all issue that is key to be discussed that comes since 1817 up to today. Wow, that's what I had to say. And you still have some time. Now I'll pass the floor to Paycheck. I think you're told that you have to ask people to change the slides, okay?
Hello? Can you hear me? Can the translators, interpreters hear me? It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I speak some Portuguese, but for the purpose of science and scientific clarity and precision, I will do this in English, but feel free to ask me any questions in Q&A in Portuguese and later on after the event. My slides are quite dense and full of text, so I will definitely arrange with the organizers to have them shared somehow, so don't pay attention to them too much. You will obviously be able to have a copy later on. And also, there is a little technical glitch on my side, which is that I cannot see my slides, so I have to look at my phone where they are, so that I remember where we are in my little talk. I hope that what I will present today feeds somehow to the debates about Tarifa Zero in São Caetano do Sul or São Paulo in general. And my goal is to draw a global picture of this policy. I have been studying this measure of abolishing fares, providing fare-free public transport for quite a few years now. I haven't been doing this alone. Next slide, if we can. I've been doing this together with a number of colleagues, recently a bunch of people in Belgium and Luxembourg. So everything that I'll be presenting here is not my own work. There is a collective labor involved. And feel free to ask my colleagues for specific parts of our research. I can direct you whether you're interested in our research in the United States or Luxembourg or Poland. I'll be more than happy to share our work and contact details of my colleagues. Next slide. So, if you go to an engineering school and you study transport, and there is an odd chance that somebody talks about fare-free public transport, it's quite likely that what you will hear is what one of the major sustainable transport scholars in the French-speaking world, but still in the world, once said, fare-free public transport is a policy that makes no sense. And for a lot of people who plan transport, including public transport, this is something that they learn quite early on. There has to be a payment. The passenger has to contribute, otherwise problems start. And if you remove the fare and if you remove the payment, horrible things will happen. We will discuss them in a minute and we will discuss why they don't happen. But this is a policy which for a lot of transport planners, transport engineers especially, makes no sense. So why are we here and why are we discussing something that makes no sense? Next slide. Well, I will very briefly try to discuss the history and geography of this policy, how it operates and how it's funded, who is the audience of it, how it's governed, how it travels, so its policy mobility, and then the whole network of the policy, something that we are probably here part of today, so the research and activist network. So as you can see, quite an ambitious plan. I will definitely skip some slides and leave them for the organizers, and then perhaps there are some questions afterwards. Next slide, and maybe immediately the one after. Great. So what are we actually talking about? I think it's important to define the object of our debate or the object of our meeting. In English, it's fare-free public transport, Tarifa Zero. What does it mean? Well, first of all, it means there is a zero in it, the fare. it doesn't mean that nobody pays. It doesn't mean that it's completely free and money is not involved. No, it means that money is involved, but the passenger does not pay. The payment is zero. And in English, the fare-free public transport aspect is important because the public is there. We're not talking about private networks run by hotels or supermarket chains or spa resorts. We're not talking about rich people, Google, and any other companies providing transport for their workers. We're talking about a public institution and a transfer of public money to a public service, sometimes operated with private measures, private companies, but it is for the interest of the public, however the public is defined. Next slide, please. Now, for me, personally, as a researcher, it was important at some point to draw a boundary about what are the cases that I'm interested in, and probably we are interested in here. And I think it's important to focus on cases that at least existed for 12 months, not some experimental projects, pilots that were implemented for a few weeks and then were abolished. This is also interesting, but what I'm looking at is systems where this policy worked for at least 12 months, where it's applied or it's offered to most of the users. There might be some exceptions, visitors, for example, people who are not official residents, but the great majority of users have access to this policy. It also embraces the great majority of the services, so it's not a line or two. It's the whole system, maybe with some minor exceptions, but it's the whole system that is available for the great majority of users most of the time. There might be a night line or some special service that sometimes is paid, but otherwise everything is very free. It's not, money is not disappeared, it's just that we don't pay at the moment of using public transport. Next slide, please. And maybe we can already go a couple of more. Yeah, one more, next. Maybe the next one, great, perfect. So, this is about the chronology of the policy. As you can see, well, it started, at least from a Western European perspective, in the 1970s. So we have some first case in the US and then a few in France. Disregarding completely, which is a very interesting topic, the whole experience of Soviet public transport planning. So a huge area of the world with almost free, if not completely free public transport in a huge amount of cities. Very little knowledge about that, or very little science produced about this. But let's stick to this more northern-centric perspective on fare-free public transport, according to which the policy really did not exist much in the 70s and 80s. And until 2010, 2017, you see there is about 100 cases worldwide. There's really a marginal story here. Something changes in the 2010s and 2020s. And today, if we can go to the next slide, not only, yeah, the next one, perfect. Not only do we have 344 cities, localities that have Tarifa Zero right now, of which, as you can see, 164 are located in Europe, 69 in the US, 106 in Brazil, which, as I will show in a moment, is by now the most numerous hub of this policy. So the most amount of cases that currently exist are actually located in Brazil. But also we have quite a number of cases, or quite a number of localities that did have the policy, experimented with it, they had it for at least 1 year, historical cases, which are now discontinued. So we also have a number of places where it existed and now it doesn't exist anymore. So quite a lot of places to study, quite a big sample for us scientists, activists to look at. Next slide, please. And as I already mentioned, so we can identify some hubs, some geographical centers of this policy, and you can be proud that it is your country, it is Brazil, that currently has the highest number of places that have the policy implemented. This is also a very recent phenomenon. This definitely was not the case 5 years ago, for example. And this is followed by, perhaps quite surprisingly, the USA with 69, then Poland, France, and also quite a recent addition, Spain. And then a flurry of smaller cases around Europe, both Western and Eastern Europe, a few in China. I will show them up in a moment. But what's very important is that this rise is very recent. So until 2010, this really was a marginal policy. Something is changing. I don't know if this is a global change or if it's a national change in several countries around the world. But this idea of abolishing fares, providing fare-free public transport, really is gaining a lot of traction, and in very different places, in very different corners of the world. At the same time, next slide, please. Yes, so I mentioned the historical cases, Bologna and Roma in Italy, also the Soviet and Cuban experiences. But at the same time, the policy is almost monthly. I get news about a new city considering it or implementing. This really something gaining speed and gaining traction. Next slide. So very quickly we can look at the global distribution of these cases. I already mentioned these main clusters. So we have the USA, Brazil, Europe principally. There's a very outlying case of Libreville in Gabon in Africa. Otherwise no known case on the African continent. Very few in Asia and only one in Australia. So this really is not a policy that exists globally everywhere. There is really some concentration geographically, which is an interesting observation perhaps. The next slide shows the distribution specifically in Europe. So we see the clusters in Poland and France, but also quite a lot of cases in Sweden and in Spain. So there's some individual cases in different European countries. Let's maybe go to the next slide. And there are some interesting stories here. So this is the fare-free public transport geography in the USA before the pandemic. It existed in very small places, mostly tourist resorts, university towns. So universities would fund public transport for its students. The idea would be that if you're a student, you have access to public transport, and this would automatically be made free also for everybody else, because most of the town is related to the university anyway. And this is US during the pandemic. The next slide. And nobody really knows why. I mean, we have some answers. Nobody really knows why, but it's in the US that the pandemic made public transport completely free in more or less 60% of all urban networks of public transport. So of all existing local urban public transport networks, 60% of them became fare-free during the pandemic in the US, which, I mean, it's one of the last countries where I would expect to see a socially redistributive policy to gain a lot of traction. And while we have some answers to why it happened, it's really difficult to tell why it's happening in the US, as I think it's difficult to tell why is it happening in Brazil, Poland, and France, and not in other countries. Okay, a lot of these places now are back to charging fares, because the idea would be that during the pandemic, you really want to limit the distance between the passenger and the driver, or this kind of proximity. So they would implement what's called rear boarding. So they would encourage passengers to board through the back, through the second door, bypassing what in Brazil functions as a catraca, and as a result, there will be no charging of the ticket. Now that the pandemic is over, at least we hope so, in the next year. So this is what remains, which might seem that, well, the policy is now kind of frozen, but still there is a significant amount of cases that remain. So as we counted, I think it's about 40 plus of those implemented during the pandemic, which together with the ones that existed before amounts to 69 of total cases existing in the US. I'll skip the next slide. We tried basically to identify in what places this policy would exist, and we found out that mostly there is really not a question of size, it's much more a question of politics. So it's a question of how does the locality vote, what kind of political party is being, has more leverage in this particular locality. And perhaps this isn't a surprise, but I think it was interesting to find that the more democratic a locality, the more likely it is to implement fare-free public transport. And also the more it was affected by the pandemic, we used some indicator that was publicly available, the more likely it was to implement Tarifa Zero. Let's skip the next. This slide, maybe we can move on from that. So next slide, please. And maybe the next one as well. Great. This is the geography of fare-free public transport in Poland. I don't accuse you of knowing the geography of Poland very well, but if I showed it to a Polish audience, so people, I myself am from the country, most of these localities are virtually unknown to most people. So these are not major cities, regional capitals, or big places at all. These are small localities that rarely make the news. When we published a paper with this map, none of these localities have ever been discussed in this Journal of Transport Geography. They never make it to the news or science. So there is a movement happening, a network happening as well, that is completely unrecognized by any national authority, not really making it to the, to the 8 o'clock news in the evening, but it's growing. It's really becoming a significant movement, a significant policy in the country. And over there, let's go to the next slide. Also, I can answer any questions you may have about this, but I imagine that geography of Poland or US is not something that you lose any sleep over. So I will get to more interesting parts and discuss them in detail later. But here the most important thing we found out is that the probability of doing Tarifa Zero in Poland does not relate to the money that the municipality has, but to the willingness to spend money. So So we found a lot of rich municipalities that have a lot of income, a lot of tax revenue, but their expenditure is quite low in proportionate terms. And it's rather the municipalities that have a commitment to actually spend public money that are more likely to implement Tarifa Zero. And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that the political component is very important. So the municipalities of particular color are are more, relatively speaking, likely to implement the policy than not. Okay, let's move on. So, when we look at this, so next slide, please. Yeah, great, this is good. If we look at this global landscape, 10 minutes, that's crazy. Let's try to shorten this. So, when we look at this local landscape, what do we see? Often an accusation is made that is about, there's a policy that is, for small localities, for places where public transport is largely underused. Well, this is kind of true because 2/3 of all these 400 plus places that have Tarifa Zero are indeed quite small, but there are very important exceptions and outliers. So a number of cities where the population is around 500,000, which maybe they are not the biggest cities in the world, but still they are large places with complex public transport networks. So this is not a policy only for small places. This is definitely not the case. Let's move on. And the next slide, please. Great. There is often an accusation made about financial instability, the fact that Tarifa Zero means that the income will be reduced and the network cannot operate anymore, that there is crowding issues, speed issues, for example. The evidence is really to the contrary. There's very few places where there's been vandalism, where there's been crowding, where the Tarifa Zero was planned in a way that seriously affected the financial stability of the network. So these are myths more often than actual scientific evidence or scientifically supported facts about the policy. Let's move on. And maybe since we have very limited time, let me see. Let's move. Keep moving the slides. Perfect. Yeah, I mentioned the vandalism. Let's move to the next. And we can discuss this later if necessary, if interested. Does it attract car drivers? It's extremely difficult to tell, and it's extremely difficult to also expect Tarifa Zero to single-handedly attract a white male who has 1 or 2 cars to public transport. Very short answer to the question of does it attract car drivers is, it does, but there has to be many other policies in place. There has to be policies which first and foremost attack the car. If you want to reduce automobility, the best way to do it is by reducing automobility, not by implementing public transport. Public transport is a good response to what happens next, or in parallel, but by offering something alternative, offering a carrot, you really cannot replace the stick. The stick has to be there, to put it in a very maybe crude and metaphorical way. But there is some limited evidence that where implemented in some conditions, it did work. It did change what we call the model split. So increasing the model part of public transport and reducing that of the car. Next slide. Quality. This has been discussed already in reference to São Carotana do Sul. There is no contradiction between making it free and making it high quality, and I fully agree with Lucio. Free things can be of good quality. We see a lot of cases where implementing Tarifa Zero was a first step towards a reform of public transport, or at least it didn't impede the reform. It didn't stop from new buses from being bought, or trams. Here we see the case of Tallinn in Estonia and Aubagne in France. Fantastic public transport networks. Maybe this is not a universal effect, but we definitely cannot say that Tarifa Zero means that the buses or whatever other public transport vehicles are being used are of bad quality. This is not the case. Okay, let's move to the next slide and the next one immediately after. Well, then there is a lot of questions. I'm aware of the time, thank you. There's a lot of questions which come more from the progressive circles, of course, about what happens to inequalities, who uses this network, is this something that supports the vulnerable users, the poor? And here the answers, and this is probably the most interesting part of the presentation, and sorry that I'm keeping it for the end, but this is where a lot of contradictions happen and where a lot of effects are quite mixed. So in some cases we see a result, in others we do not. Let's move to the next slide, yeah, after this one, the next one. So here we see, I can discuss this in detail later on, we see the increase of usage of public transport after it was implemented in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, a city of about 500,000 inhabitants. And we see that across different age groups, income groups, and occupational groups, especially the vulnerable ones, so people with low income, people with unemployment, or people who are on a pension, they significantly increase their mobility. They move more because this policy is implemented. The only group in which we see reported, so declared decrease of usage of public transport are the richest people. The question is whether they use public transport in the first place, or whether they basically declare, now that it's free, I use it even less. I didn't use it, but now I use it even less. And this is, I think, quite a common response, a common narrative of the elites with regard to anything that's public and anything that's collective, which for them is a source of fear, because of course it means contact with the other, contact with people who are not of the social circles. But people who are poor or on the poorer side and vulnerable use public transport more as a result of Tarifa Zero in some cases. This is maybe not a universal effect, but an effect that we can see in some places. Next slide and the next slide, and maybe even the next one. Let's really focus on the ending now. And the next one, please. Great. But then, of course, there are a lot of bold statements and a lot of high hopes by a lot of movements formulated in relation to Tarifa Zero. There is really, and Brazil obviously is the cradle of a lot of these calls and a lot of these statements that really put a lot of hope for building some very alternative, anti-capitalist or post-capitalist future with Tarifa Zero in the center of it. And I'm afraid that, you know, I really value and respect the hopes and the slogans, but I see that the reality on the ground is extremely complex and really depends on each case of the policy and how it's implemented. And really, for that we need to go all the way to the conclusions, let's say. Yeah?
Você mostrou o cachorrinho chileno, eu vou te dar mais 5 minutos.
Ah, obrigado. Muito legal. So, if I have 5 minutes, I can do this, no problem. So, on the one hand, we have, for example, a case of Aubagne in France, where the policy was implemented across a number of, well, there was a town and a number of villages, and the idea was to connect them in a solidarity-driven network, to create a free public transport system which allows people who live far in the periphery to connect to the town, to go to the cinema, to meet their friends, to meet their family. And there was no competition between these localities whatsoever. They had very different budgets. It's the main town that pays for most of it because they have the most resources. So the idea is to create a system which acts like a glue. It puts people together, it allows them to interact. So that's one story. And you could say, well, it is some kind of alternative vision of the future. If we go to the next slide though, to the next story, that's Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, which did this policy, but only offered it to its residents, official taxpayers of the city. What it meant was that it drew tax-paying residents from neighboring municipalities. In Estonia, it's extremely easy to change your address, to change your tax residency. So what happened is that people who wanted to use public transport for free, on the internet, it's as easy as it is. Within 15 minutes, they managed to change the address, and they became Tallinn residents, and now they have access to free public transport, which of course means that they don't pay taxes in a number of poorer localities that surround the city, which means that Tarifa Zero became an aspect or a policy of territorial competition, of attracting capital, human financial capital from other localities, rather than creating some solidarity network or thinking about the other and thinking about, let's say, the metropolitan scale. We can go to the next slide, perhaps. Yes, Luxembourg, for example. It's an extremely interesting case because, well, it's the first nation state to implement the policy. And over there, it was purely used, at first at least, as an electoral strategy, which we can attack and we can be angry about that politicians, well, want to win elections. But it was put on the table purely to win an election, to gather electoral support, and to create some kind of international marketing, without reflecting a lot about mobility. So Tarifa Zero, yes, it's a transport and mobility policy, but for those who actually came up with the policy, first and foremost, it was about the attention, about the media time that they got, about the media time that they got internationally as well, with some effect on mobility as well. So definitely not a progressive policy that is there about, you know, tackling inequalities or dealing with the mobility of the vulnerable people. The next slide, I'm really going to the end. Workers, which is a massive group involved in Tarifa Zero and very often absent from the discussion that leads to the debates about the policy. And unfortunately, I've seen cases where the workers would be completely forgotten, informed about the policy in an email, or even fired, especially the cobradores, those who would charge the tickets in the past. You could say that this is rational planning. I mean, this is what has to be done. But this is not a progressive policy necessarily if the workers are not on board, if we're not doing this policy with them. So the question is, yeah, can we do it differently? Can we do it in a way that involves them as well? And this is where I'm going to conclude very quickly with 3 slides, nothing more. And the next one, please, and the next one, and we have to skip a few. The next one, and the next one. Perfect, conclusions. So, what is Tarifa Zero from an international perspective? First of all, it's a policy that does exist. Does the free bus exist, is the title of this conference. Yes, it does, in almost 400 places, and over 400 if we count those where there is a historical case. It existed for a significant amount of time. There is clear concentration of these cases in different geographical areas, Brazil being clearly one of them. And it's a simple idea, but it's not the same policy everywhere. It really depends on the context. It exists in very different ways in different places. And this is the problem, because often we can be told that it's one thing, and we go to another place and it's something completely different. Next slide, please. So, we have clear evidence of its social and spatial impact. So it does affect mobility of vulnerable people. It does make vulnerable people move more and move better. But it's much less evidence of the environmental effect. So especially this shift to the public transport from the car. This is something that we would like to happen perhaps, but it's not as easy as we would like to achieve, because just reducing the price to 0 is not enough to attract car drivers, unfortunately. It's much more complicated than that. Then the third conclusion or set of conclusions is about the political dimension of Tarifa Zero. As anything in public transport, Tarifa Zero is an extremely political object. That I don't mean it in a derogatory term. I don't mean that this is only about elections and about politicians making claims and wanting to win elections by throwing slogans at us. No, I mean that anything done in public transport is political by essence. And that means that there is contradictions involved, and that means that there is struggles involved and interest groups. Not everybody will be happy, not everybody will be satisfied. It can be reduced to a pure technology of increasing efficiency. It can be a progressive policy that deals with inequalities and tries to imagine a future beyond, let's say, capitalism. Both are possible even in the same city, which complicates our evaluation of the policy. And then, this is really my last slide. This means that we need to make Tarifa Zero what we want it to be. It's not, as in French we have this expression, a magic wand. It's not something that we just implement in a city, it touches the ground and things change and life is beautiful. It's something that involves constant struggle, I think that's the word, of passengers, of workers. I really think that workers have to be involved at all stages of this policy. If we really, I imagine that most of us do, want this policy to be a progressive one that acts against inequalities mobility. Otherwise, it might be taken by whoever wants to take this policy from the left all the way to the right, which is happening as well, doing it in a way that probably we would not like it to happen. Thank you very much. I leave my articles and my big thanks to the organizers again. You can contact me anytime after the event, by email, Instagram. I will leave my slides as well. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking so much time.
When I was speaking, I didn't thank for the presence of you all, and I didn't thank for the invitation made by Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Free Fare Movement and all the folks that have invited me, so sorry for that. All right, now we're going to have, as we started, talking about the São Caetano experience, we're going to talk with Celso Abadi, who's the president of the public transportation company of Maricá City. Celso and the public transportation company of Maricá was the first city that opened the door to receive this group of researchers that you're seeing here. Celso Haddad is the person that creates miniatures of buses and ruffles them. He has even brought us the miniature of a bicycle. And I have the great pleasure to call Celso to come forward to share about the reality of Maricá. And I'd like to thank him once again to be with us in this journey. It's a privilege to have you here once again. Good evening. It's an honor to be at this table with the city councilor, the representative, and for so many years we had some fights in the transport authority in the city, so it's so great to receive this mobility class as I'm a manager of this company. So thank you for the foundation, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Daniel, and the invitation made, and EPT Maricá will be in all discussions regarding fare free in terms of social right, as has been said by all, and we'll see how this affects the city and how this affects the daily lives of people who has the right of transport and how it affects the city and citizenship. So Maricá is a city of over 200,000 people. In the past 10 years has grown 54%, foreseeing that public policies, as the professor and Lucio mentioned, public policy or public services has or have to be the best quality possible. And there's no limits to enhance it. That's why we understand the city of Maricá, in the city of Maricá, that the result, the outcome of public policies that are so successful, providing better services, literally affect the lives of every citizen. And as a result of that, the city will grow. Let me share something. The public transportation company was created in 2014, and that's important to say, through a political decision, through saying, hey, tomorrow I'm going to change the policy, I'm going to change the results of social right for transportation will reach everyone. I will take out the monopoly of private companies on that sector. It's a difficult decision that has to be planned and will face so many barriers. So Maricá is using fare free for 10 years now. In the beginning, because we had the concession of private companies, and since 2021, at the end of the concessions, those city routes are operated by the municipality. So the decision of the people, of what is public, has to focus on people. So next slide, please. This chart shows the best public service provided, having a great growth. And it's important to say that at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, that Maricá was the city that was surrounding the cities of Rio, the city that close to Rio that would receive less resources in their budget. So fare free is not connected to the amount of resources, but it's connected to planning and ways of funding this. But depending on the bias of the manager, so to say, of the city has in terms of priorities, in terms of security, transportation, housing, education, health, as Luisa Erundina had tried to do here, and we expect that this kind of result can reach everyone. So, speaking about the Constitution, or our Constitution, we have to make other regulations to have that right to be done. So go for it. Make the mayor of each city to implement and see ways of funding this. But who wants to focus on their own city has to go where people need it the most. That is where Maricá thinks that we want to do in 2015 with 3 routes. Now we have 22. 13 buses in the beginning, now 135 buses in a city of 200,000 people. Year 1, 2 million passengers, now more than 38 million commuters in a year. Next slide. So here you have the 106 cities that has a fare-free public transport in Brazil. Next slide. This chart is related to 2023, 39 routes. Now we have 42 routes. More than 3.5 million commuters per month. Maricá is not the biggest city in Brazil today in terms of population, but it's the city in Brazil that transports more people in a monthly or weekly or yearly basis in terms of fare-free public transport, because we understand that public transport has to be the best possible. In the previous chart, you saw that in 2021, Maricá was the city in Brazil or on Earth as a whole that hasn't reduced the amount of buses. We're not thinking about expenditure, but we are seeing this as an investment, providing the best public transport to people. During the pandemic, we would be very limited in terms of sanitation, of health procedures. So in all buses we had sanitizers, hand sanitizers, and all the health safety measures we had during the pandemic. So we have to pay attention to those who pay taxes and provide the best service possible for taxpayers. This is the monitoring of all buses and routes we have in the city, encompassing the whole city. Maricá is a big is a city that has a big occupies a big area. So this shows how much we have saved. More in 2023, more than 208 million reals were cost. More than 280 million would go to private companies as a result of the fares. Those expenditures are now being spent in the city of Maricá. So with the fare-free public transport, it's not only about charging a fare or not only about not charging it or not, but this shows the results. Less people going to hospital because of traffic accidents, more people, more money for the families. They have some 20% of the family income were spent in public transport that is no longer spent now by families. Some researches show some research is done in a classroom when it was asked, what did you like the most in 2023? And the child said, I could go to the city center, I could go to the shopping mall, I could go to a given, I could go to the shore, or to a family that lives far away, a city that is close to Maricá, and this person lived there for 40 years and they didn't know another district of the city that was more far away from them. So this is providing citizenship, a sense of citizenship to the citizens. It's an investment in the economy, in the culture, and for people's citizenship, which reflects in terms of growth in the city. Next one. That's the result of fare-free public transport. The amount of companies in 2014 was this, and 10 years later, see the amount of companies in the city. See how much tax collection we have, 27 million in 2014, and 2023, 120 millions. This is what fare-free public transport means. This is the reflection of what we got in our city with the free fare public transport. In a city that didn't get much resources, and by a political decision, we have implemented this. When with fundings come from royalties, we could activate several areas in the city, thinking only in the population and provide them dignity. Professor mentioned the public aspect of that. And it's important to listen to people. So Maricá and EPT has this itinerant ombudsman. And why do we do that? Only the community, the local community knows what are the challenges they have in their locality. The bus comes to the bus stop at 7. It could be 7:10. Well, they can provide suggestions for us. So we have this amount of buses, and the population has to comply with that. No, the public authority has to provide quality public transport, because they brings us claims, suggestions, questions, so the public authority can provide better services on a daily basis. In 2024, through planning, we will receive 10 new buses to renovate the fleet. So those buses will be turnstiles free, with a system of coding of the commuters in the doors, because Maricá is a social right, as we understand it. So why the turnstile? That instrument of charging and restricting the rights of commuters, so those buses will be turnstile free. And in 2025, all the buses of Maricá fleet will be turnstile free. And we will increase the number of buses in the fleet, because as we saw in the chart, the demand is growing. So the more you offer, the more people want to ride buses, because they have the right to commute and move around. Very quickly, I'm running out of time, so there's another model, which are the free bicycles. They're called vermelhinhas, the red bicycles. We have 25 bike stations with 150 bikes. In May 26th, we will have more bicycles. There will be 70 stations in 3 months' time, with 700 bicycles all around the city. And this year, we will include bicycles for handicapped people. So models have to provide limitless access to people. So bicycle has some restrictions. So there will be bicycles adapted for people with disabilities, and 10 stations for children's bicycles as well. Maricá, as you know, receives royalties from a polluting matrix, and we are investing in the decarbonization in a matrix that does not pollute, which is hydrogen. We have electric bus, electric and ethanol, and the best model is a partnership of the city with the University of Rio de Janeiro. So in 2038, in 15 years' time, all the fleet will be decarbonized, zero carbon. So it's important to highlight that in 2022, more than 42% of people in Maricá take buses. 5% ride a bicycle, and only 19% drive a car. So the investment in public services, in public transportation models, so cars will not be so much used by all different income classes investing in collective transport. 9 years of EPT. Next slide. So here we have some materials for you to check and have access to the presentation, to the Ombudsman, the EPT website, with all transparency of the actions of this company. So once again, thank you very much for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Daniel, here on this beautiful table. So if this is a right, we'll be here standing for it. So thank you very much.
No, we're not going to raffle that because I'm going to keep it. There's no democracy here. Sorry. I'm going to keep it. Sorry, guys. That's the way life is. So, now we have our Q&A moment so that we can exchange with the people here on our table. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank you for those here on the table who were willing to come over and discuss with us. I'd like to thank everyone who makes this event happen. So all the translation, broadcast, audio, video, food. There's food. You should wait. And ask questions before you eat. And I'd like to really thank everyone who contributed to build this event. And once again, I'd like to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Andrea specifically, who has always supported this process to build the networks. And personally, I'd like to thank once again those who are here and those who I didn't know, because one of the things that we've been doing in the recent years is to make this network grow. So we have social movements, researchers, managers, professors, people from abroad. We got everything, and that's very good. The more different people, the more diversity, the better, because we win perspective. We leverage our network. So thank you, UFABC, for providing the physical space of exchange. I am thrilled that you're all here, especially those who are watching us online. So thank you once again. Thank you all. And I'm looking forward to have your questions. So just a minute, let me walk around with the mic. Well, guys, first of all, good evening. It's really awesome to see the discussion here. It's important that we do it much more often. While we were listening to your debates and bringing out those topics, I made some notes. I've been studying a lot of that because I am working on that perspective as well. So I like to throw in 3 questions. Some of them are kind of like provocations, others are more like questions, and whoever wants to answer that, I don't have to hear from anyone specifically. The first thing that is kind of clear to me about public transport and the free fare,
is about the facing the logic of mercantilization. In public transport, at least in this perspective of how it works in an economic system as capitalism, for instance, we have it as a merchandise that transports merchandise. Most people who use buses, they are going to work. And under the perspective of capital that we live, when we're going to work, we're selling our workforce. So we are seen by the company owners as merchandise as well. So I think it's very important when Maricá did that with APT, when they faced the different sectors of the bourgeois in that industry by having this public agency, and little by little that became as big as it got. So that's very important, and the experiences that we must have as a role model kind of follow that direction under my perception. That was the first thing. The second thing is about what Lucio brought in regarding the PEC 25, the Bill of Law 25, which is about the new sources of revenue, and that was about individual transportation. That is so right, because you do reduce traffic when you have free public transport, but that's something to be thought about. I don't know if that's a dynamic, but something that would have follow like a table according to like older vehicles and newer vehicles, more expensive vehicles pay more, which is what makes sense to me. But back to what was said before, if we take public transport to go to work and the companies do pay for transport, it also makes sense that you create a transport voucher for the companies to pay, following the same logic. So if it's a large company, the company pays more. If the company is small, they pay little or almost nothing. So that will be something else to add on, so that we can enable that. That will be another possibility of revenue to make it happen. And finally, to wrap up, I'd like you to discuss on how austerity policies such as the fiscal framework can have an effect on the policies such as the universal public transport system. We have to keep that in mind. So I'm Diogo Mendes. I'm from Santo André. Thank you. Anyone else? Let's go on a round of questions. Hi, good evening. I'm Livio. I'm a student here at UFABC, and I'd like to ask, I just took a class approaching urban mobility and transport, and we did a work about the fare free, and one thing that I kept in mind was the aspect that Brazil being a hub, considering that since 2022 40 cities in Brazil have adopted the fare free public transport. We had 60 that year. We're now at 105, 110 cities, whereas in the rest of the world that kind of slowed down. So that's something that drew my attention, and one of the things that I think about is what are the characteristics of the cities. We see that they're usually mid-sized cities that do have a political thing with more chances of being left-wing, and I mean, that's one of the things I was thinking about. And what are the conditions that make Brazil maybe a leader on those initiatives, on how we sort of contaminate the ideas? You know, we see them doing there, maybe we can do it here as well. So, and one second thing that I was thinking about is considering the implementation and wider distribution and the growth of the idea. I'd like to ask a more technical questions regarding funding. So to fund this practice, maybe that's more a question to Wojciech. If in practice of the funding, is it something that engaged more new ways of funding, like new taxes and new fees, or was it something that already took advantage of the previous income that we already had? In case of Maricá, I do believe that was mostly based on the oil royalties. So How is that done based on the existing structure? The how do you replan, reorganize that, or how is just like had come up with a new tax for that? Like we've thought about the tax over vehicles, right? That Representative Erundina was presenting. So those were my two questions. Okay, a woman maybe. Hi, how are you guys? I am a woman with lots of ideas. I'm always in awe with this fare free public transport. I never read a book about it, but there's a friend of mine who's wonderful. And she said, "Hey, you should go. You should go." You know, so I have this bill of law of a popular initiative, and I guess you can sign it because once we're here, anyone can take a bus, free fare bus. You can go there and move around freely when it's implemented. So I do believe that there must be something on the popular initiative law that needs to be for the citizens of a certain city. But I mean, it's free. We can start a campaign now. This is the second time I'm thinking about this popular initiative law because when I read the Constitution, I was in love with this instrument, and we almost don't use it, or we don't think about it. So I am from the Rede Sustentabilidade, the Sustainability Network. I am going to be a candidate in the election, so and my name is on here. I call this the Sunday bus. And everybody, when they see the name of the bill of law, hey, it's free, great, I'll sign it. It's super easy. People totally take it. So I think that's maybe an idea for those who want to implement in your city. And you do bring up a lot of people because we're only two here, me and my husband, catching signatures in bus stops and whatever events we have around the city. I guess it's gonna work. The idea is gonna work, but I'd like to know if Kika and I, as we're not so known, or right, we're not Renata Falzoni, but how do you see that? Do you think that's a good initiative? Because ideally, we should have people's engagement. You know, there were different fare-free movements there, but I wasn't there because I thought it was kind of utopic. Now, I say, yeah, I think I can make it. I'll try. We gotta have like a 5%, so it's possible. But I do love the Amazon standing project. I don't know if you know, but you also have to. But the boring part of this popular initiative law, you have to vote. You have to be able to be registered to vote. But the people of Amazon Standing decided to have a simple form, and once you have the person's the full name, the mother's name, and the birth date, you can find the person's voting card number. So we need to have a team later on to catch all that info, and that's something, instead of putting your taxpayer number that everybody knows, but they do demand for your voting card number. Easy, right? So that was it. Thank you. So, back to the table. So let's pass the mic on to each one of you to answer. 3 minutes for answering. Let's start over on that end. Well, you did approach some things about the people who are here in the event regarding the question asked by the first participant, and I'm going to focus more on the fiscal framework and what would it be of public policies. And I'm going to give you the example of the city of Maricá, where we've had this policy since 2014. It's been 10 years that we've had this policy, and through time we have been prioritizing public policies. So we had a sovereign fund to be sure that the oil royalties that subsidize a good part of the city is a finite source of energy. So we had a sovereign fund saying that from now on, if the royalties were over now, for another 10 years, those public policies would not stop. And it's important to mention, as somebody said up there, when you think of today, there's no return. For instance, I mean, we saw in the presentation that many companies, we have a lot of companies in the city of Maricá, and today they do not incentivize anything for the city because they no longer pay for people's transport. The transport voucher, that would be a source of funding so that our fare-free public transport could be subsidized monthly or yearly, as well as other sorts of funding. So, based on your question, the city of Maricá, through the city administration, we want to reach the end of this year. It's an electoral year for the city. We want to get to 10 to 12 years to support those public policies. We have our own currency and investment for the city. So we do receive, many people receive a certain money for like a basic income guaranteed, and they have to spend that money in the city because the currency is only accepted in the city. So that kind of public policy helps the city to grow. So regarding that, I couldn't approach everything that you said, but regarding that, it is important to say, because today the Marca investment money comes from royalties, oil royalties. The oil can end tomorrow. So if that ends tomorrow, our investments are going to end tomorrow. So I'll give you two reasons. It's also about the people belonging. Today the city, the people who live in the city of Maricá, people who work there or maybe who visit the city today, in the bus, the bike, in the different transport models, they feel that they belong to it. They say, this is my right. I want that right. I want it to be as good as possible for me, for the city, for the people. And I say that in a very broad way when you think of policies. If you change the political management, either from left, center, right, nobody will remove that right because that's sculpted on the city, on the people. People depend on that social right that, of course, the city of Maricá has implemented. So it's important to say that because the fare free is not a project, it's a right that people have, and of course the cities need to plan, they need to find their money and fund it so that doesn't have like a time to end, that should be given to people forever, of course. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the first person who asked all the questions, the first question, so I'll generically talk about some things and others specifically, which are things that I actually heard. So, why does Brazil have so many cities with this policy? Well, that's pretty much explained because most of it comes from the fact that the companies that dealt with urban public transport, mostly buses, they found out that actually the fare is not a cost, it's income. So with the pandemic, the number of passengers dropped, therefore their income has dropped, and that made an important sector of the country to start disputing for the fare-free public transport by enabling this in several cities because of their interest, making sure that the public transport system would again be profitable. That's one point. Another point that comes to mind is key in spite of this growth explained by what I said. We are 100 and something cities, which considering Brazil is still very little. We have thousands of cities, municipalities. So of course there has to be a way for some sort of funding for the fare free. That's a really key point, of course. The Maricá issue really has to do with the oil, and of course when we think of structural ways to fund public systems in Brazil is key, and we need to discuss it for real. It's about time we do it, and that was said here. This tax that I mentioned goes in that direction. This CONUS, based on what I said, is enough. It can totally fund the existing public transport. So it is really key to discuss ways, structural ways of funding in the Brazilian society to guarantee transport as a social right, which is another thing that does solve some things that were raised here. So if it is on the Constitution and it is a social right, such as public transport, that has to somehow generate some sort of funding to the system. And finally, I'd like to remind you of a very important thing. A considerable part of the population, when the fare free is implemented, they are going to spend this money in different areas of the economy, and that will benefit from that money. So we can easily see increasing revenue in certain areas in retail when a fare free is implemented. So we need to make sure that we call up those businesses to be on our side, because they're going to benefit from that. So it's about transforming the fare free public transport into much more than a social political movement, which are also key for that, but also bring in other fundamental sectors of the economy to discuss that point once, as I said, that has been said since 1812 and set up in a very weird way that steals money from the population. It steals money from other sectors of the economy in a very wrongful way. So I think we should discuss more on that. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Well, focus on those two technical questions. My contribution is, well, I'm not an expert on that topic, but I have been following up the situation in São Caetano since the implementation of fare-free public transport. The model of financing shows the kind of fare-free system we are implementing. I was just loving Celso's example on Maricá and the data, and that it's a public transportation company. We have the transition of a private company in a logics that what it would be paid by itself, they would receive it from the city administration to provide the same service, but in a wider scale. So in the beginning I said I'd like to mention about financing again, but today the funding of São Caetano means 3%, represents 3% of our annual budget in the city. So this comes out of our budget, annual budget in the city budget, and it's, peanuts if you consider the total amount of the budget. So this comes from mobility fees and general fees that are collected by the city and by selling carbon credits. So we were trying to think how the car system could feed back this fare-free public transport system. We have the rotation, parking in the streets that is different from São Paulo. If you park in the street in São Paulo, you have to you gotta fine if you don't pay for the this park space where you have parked your car. But in São Caetano they check. If you don't have, if you didn't pay the fee, you have to pay 20 reals that you have to pay in 24 hours. Only if you don't pay those 20 reals, that will be turned into a fine. It's a big business to provide, to apply tickets in São Paulo if you park your car and you don't pay for the parking space. And that's absurd because this fine, this ticket, doesn't come back to the municipality. 20% only goes to the city administration. So that's ridiculous. So that's a way, in terms of public policy, that will represent a trade-off. If you use the money of the parking system, the city parking system in the streets would be used in the public, in the fare-free public transport, that would be awesome, because the private sector, the private thing, should feed the public thing. So each city has a different way of charging for car spaces in the streets. And there's another project of in São Caetano. We had an experience of a popular initiative of a law. It's quite worksome. Really collect signatures for your project, but this kind of law with popular participation is great, because people can know they can be part of the production of a law, and this makes people to participate in lawmaking process, making them debate, and that's what is important in terms of urban mobility discussions. So yes, it is possible to have a bus without a turnstile, or, but for October, we were saying that we needed to create a culture of urban mobility in São Caetano, and all of a sudden we had the fare-free public transport. So this is kind of a cultural seed of what is possible to do. So good luck for you.
Reply in English, so we might need a translation. I hope it's working. I will go straight to the more technical question about taxation or the financing of Tarifa Zero. I don't know if I can speak about the world. I definitely cannot speak about Brazil, so I know a lot of cases in Europe and the US. And I would say that normally it does not, so making Tarifa Zero does not normally involve implementing a new tax, although some cases like this exist as well, but they are more a minority. It's rather one of the two scenarios. So either it's peanuts, as we heard, because the income from fares is very low, if not anecdotally low. So the network is so underused and the passengers are so poor that compared to the actual cost of maintaining the network, the income from fares is really not what makes the network run. It's the subsidy that existed there from the very beginning, and it's just a question of increasing the subsidy from 60, 70, 80% to 100, in some cases even 95%. So this is really just a question of adding a little bit more. If that's not the case, and such places also exist, this is a question of shifting political priorities. So making a bold decision not to do something else and instead do Tarifa Zero. And for example, there is a case of Dunkirk in France, in the northern part of the country, where the mayor decided not to build a new stadium and instead decided that rather than build a new stadium, the city needs a fare-free public transport network, and put this to a vote. So he ran with this electoral proposal and he won, and he implemented Tarifa Zero instead of building a stadium. Maybe it's controversial, but maybe this is also what we expect politicians to do, to have bold ideas, to put them to the ballot, to have people decide on this, and then once voted in, make these policies a reality. I think in the discussion, maybe this is not a response to the questions from the floor, but rather the discussion that is going on here, I think it's an interesting question whether Tarifa Zero should be operated by a public company or a private operator. And I think that much as I would like it to be a public company in most cases, I know that in some, like in São Caetano do Sul, maybe this is not possible from the very beginning, or it's not possible at all, I don't know. But I think what's more important is what political priorities are behind Tarifa Zero, whether it's operated by a public or a private company. So what working conditions are in place? They can be bad in a publicly owned company as well, as much as in a privately owned one. What is the distribution of profit from FRES, or revenue from FRES? Are they going back to the network, or are they, for example, going to a budget from which also road infrastructure is being funded, right? So what is the mission of public transport? Does it make profit? Is the idea that it makes profit? Or is the idea that it is a social company that provides a good quality service for all the people in all the territory? So it goes as far as it can and embraces everybody as much as it's possible. So there is some kind of a clash of or contradiction of logic sometimes, because of course private companies, they are interested in the profit for the shareholders, whereas public companies are interested in the social mission, providing a service to the citizenry. But sometimes, and there are cases of Tarifa Zero systems operating like this can be resolved. And there are, for example, cases which might seem very contradictory at first of Tarifa Zero implemented in places where public transport is run by multinational corporations, like Veolia, for example, which is a massive conglomerate running hundreds of public transport networks, one of which is Tarifa Zero. And they were very interested in shifting their logic and not focusing on profit in that locality and working with a communist municipality in France. This is, on one hand, it might seem like a major contradiction, but if there is a political will to control that company and the way that it operates, it can also work. So it's, I think there is some nuance there. And then on to a very philosophical and maybe academic question of Tarifa Zero and capitalism and mobility in capitalism. I think if I'm not mistaken, it's Diego asking the question. I think indeed it's a very interesting question of why do we move and why do we need public transport? And indeed it is, the very idea of public transport is to move workers to the workplace, to individualize them, to make sure that it's possible for the workers to be atomized, not to be able to, well, to avoid as much as possible a concentration at the workplace and have a system that allows for bringing them to their home and back, so that we create a system where individual mobility is possible and the workers hopefully don't organize and capitalism can move on. But also to add some nuance to this, in many cities, I don't know about the Brazilian context, but in Europe at least, work-related mobility is not the major type of mobility. It's much more related to care and to leisure. So we move because we need to take care of others. We need to take care of our children or people who are in our household. And also we move because we want to see people and we want to see places. And the idea, I'm not saying that you have this idea, but there is this idea which is very common still in transport engineering, which goes back to a very Marxist approach to transport planning, is that the main trip is the work-home trip, or home to work, which is of course mostly done by a male who is white and wears a suit. And that kind of mobility is a minority. So applying Tarifa Zero does not necessarily mean that we facilitate a system of exploiting workers and only facilitating mobility for work. Although of course that mobility is also, enabled. And to throw one more idea to the hat is that, well, if we start questioning the right to mobility or the right to Tarifa Zero, if we go back 3-4 years to the pandemic, we had a very good exercise in the right to immobility. So there were people who had the right not to be mobile. And they were very, very privileged in the elite, not having to leave their home, or even being able to fly to their 3rd or 4th home and stay there for 3 years, enjoying not having to go out, which is, I think, a much more dystopian scenario, where we do not facilitate mobility, which I think is a very common social condition these days. So we are mobile, whether we like it or not. Thank you.
Bem, a gente viu aqui, por exemplo, que vários de
We have seen that several of us are advocating that an operation would be public in the mobility system. Others do not advocate that so emphatically, but many of us advocate for a concession. So we have some things to consider here. With regards to funding the transport system, parking spaces in the cities, how do you call it here? In São Paulo, it's called Zona Azul, the blue area, blue zone. Oh, there are other ways. We can think of other sources of income. São Paulo has this turning system where different car plates ending in 1 and 2 cannot ride on Mondays, 3 and 4 cannot ride on Tuesdays, and so forth. So they could pay a fee, and those fees could subsidize the public transportation. So there isn't a single model. There are many models. And you have to consider that the model of development of the country was based on the automobile industry. So we have to find other ways for sustainable growth in the country to get rid of the imposition of cars. But now I think the key thing, there are other ways to make those maths. We are considering 106 cities that has fare free. But how many people use it? How many people use the fare free system? How many in Maricá, in São Caetano? How many in Calcaia? How many in here and there? If you sum up them all, maybe it will not be the population of a big city. I don't know. That's another way to do the maths. But anyway, the key point is, first, Brazil is a unequal country, very unequal country. Many people cannot afford the public transportation today. That's crucial. That's key. So this is no longer a business as it has been in the past. So capitalism has to find ways to preserve the business, this business model. And the way they are finding is to pick up money from the city administration. So the city that is going to health, education is no longer going to be applied in those areas. That's what they want to do. Each experience is different. Some people mention the transportation subsidized. They did that in Campo Grande. So companies no longer had to pay for the transportation, part of the transportation fee of their employees, and they started to pay for the fare free. In Porto Alegre, they have proposed a funding model where part of that would be funded by this fee that companies pay for the transportation of their employees. So people do not have money to move around. So I tend to agree that the point is no longer if people go to work. It's no longer the case because we don't have jobs for everyone.